shop.
What's up, guys? Welcome back. I'm glad you made it back for another episode of What's in the Shop. Got some pretty interesting stuff lined up today. I always try to pick out interesting stuff, but I'm quite jazzed about some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. I hope you'll appreciate it too. Let's get started with this guy from my hometown. Don't know how much you know about him. I didn't know that much, except that he had a big fro. But I'm talking about Mr. Billy Preston. What we have here is his single, Nothing from Nothing. But we'll get to that in a minute. What about Billy Preston? Why is he important? Of course he's important. He's one of those guys that, aside from being a Texan and from my hometown, played with a lot of key people. Played with the Beatles and the Stones. How about that? He also played with Little Richard. But let me explain something first. How all that got to be. 10 years old, Billy Preston was already playing organ for the gospel great singer Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia, however you say it. And I happen to have this here. World's greatest gospel singer. You see that right there? Anyway, just happen to have this in the shop. As a young kid, he was playing keyboard for Mahalia. He went on later to play with a couple different people who became big in the soul world. I don't know why. I want to say he played with Ray Charles too. I could be wrong, but I think he did. But he did end up playing, as he got older, with Little Richard. And it was while he was on tour with Little Richard in Germany that he met the Beatles. Now, what I want to talk about Billy Preston with the Beatles is, during the Get Back sessions, John Lennon actually tried to get the other three guys to allow Billy Preston to join the Beatles. There must have been such a connection there, because if you go back and look at all your Beatles songs, all your Beatles records and singles, you'll find Billy Preston is the only person ever on a Beatles track to be given a co-writing song credit. Or I think most of the labels that you see for the singles, at least, of Get Back have the Beatles with Billy Preston. Only guy that ever happened to. That's pretty cool. But I want to talk about this real quick. Nothing from Nothing. This was his second single, and it got to number one, I believe. Yes, it did. It made it to number one. It came out in 1974. What's cool about this track is he played that single as the very first musical guest on Saturday Night Live. How about that? I'll tell you another little interesting fact about Billy Preston that I didn't know until I was reading up on him. He wrote the song You Are So Beautiful for Joe Cocker, which is probably Joe's biggest, most famous song that he has. Billy Preston, though, kind of lost control there for a while. He got into drugs and alcohol. One of the main reasons why that happened was because one of his buddies, Sly Stone, he came home one day and found his buddy, Sly Stone, in bed with his fiancée, Kathy Silva. And I happen to have a Sly Stone record right here. This is Small Talk. This was the last Sly Stone record to hit the top 40. And as you can see here, here's Sly, this is Kathy, and this is their son, Sylvester Jr. Sylvester is Sly's real name, by the way. What was so devastating, well, it's devastating to find your good friend, best friend, I don't know if he's best friends, but your friend in bed with your fiance. But what was an extra blow to Mr. Preston was the fact that Sly proposed to, and well, I shouldn't say proposed to, but married Kathy Silva on stage at Madison Square Garden. That is a real gut punch, if there ever was one. Oh, one other thing about Sly. Yes, it was his last album to hit the top 40. But it's also interesting to note one of the singles off this album, again, one of his last that cracked the top 40, was Time for Living. If you look around and find the Help album, which came out in the 1990s to benefit those victims of war in Kosovo and whatever, there's a version of that Sly tune on there done by the Chemical Brothers and the Charlatans. Also interesting to note on this album, on the track Loose Booty, the Beastie Boys took a sample from that song and used it on their Shadrach song on Paul's Boutique. Just a little trivia there for those keeping track. But back to Mr. Preston, and what he continues to have to do with today's talk is this: the Rolling Stones. This is Tattoo You, the last great Stones album, in my opinion. Came out in 1981, and it was actually the last Rolling Stones album that Billy Preston played on. And it was the last Stones album to go to #1. It's funny because they had a string of hits during the 70s where every studio album the Stones put out, starting from Sticky Fingers up until this baby, went to #1. And this would make the last appearance as #1. This was also the first album that the Stones did in halves. Or I should say, there is a rock side, maybe that's the Mick side, and the Keith side. Or maybe he's the rock side and this is the ballad side. So there's a rock side and a ballad side. This was also the first Stones album that wasn't really recorded in a studio, but was a composite, was made up of a bunch of different leftover Stone songs, dating back to 1972, I believe it was, with Goat's Head Soup. In fact, the first single, everybody knows the first single from this album, is Start Me Up. Again, it's one of the most popular Stone songs ever. That actually came from, I believe it was 1978, from the Some Girls sessions. And it was kind of done in a reggae tense, in a reggae style. In fact, right now in the shops, this album was just re-released as one of those super deluxe albums. And you can actually hear the early working version of the reggae version of Start Me Up on the new deluxe version. But what I want to talk about too are some of the early tracks that were left over from the Goat's Head Soup session. And I believe it was Tops and, oh my gosh, what was it? Tops and Waiting on a Friend. And that's the one I really want to focus on. That was the second single from Tattoo You. And it features a guest solo. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Waiting on a Friend, believe it or not, was one of the most played videos on MTV's during its heyday in the 80s. And you can kind of understand why. Interesting thing about that, the video is shot where Mick is standing on the stoop of a building, whistling and waiting on Keith. He's waiting on his friend, right? Well, a couple neat things to notice. If you notice that building, if you get a good look at it, that's at, what is it, 96 to 98, whatever it is, 95, 96, I don't know. St. Mark's Place, which is the same exact building Led Zeppelin used on the cover of their Physical Graffiti, which, by the way, came out before Tattoo You. Interesting thing, too, you'll notice a couple black guys on the stoop with Mick. I believe it's one of those gets up when Keith walks over and shakes his hand. I haven't seen the video in a long time, so forgive me if my timeline is wrong. But the black guy who shakes Keith's hand is Peter Tosh. And you have to understand, maybe you knew this, maybe not, but Mick sang a duet with Pete on his Bush Doctor album, which came out in '78. Pete was actually signed to Rolling Stone Records. So it's interesting to see Peter Tosh in the video. You'll also notice when they get to the bar that Ronnie Wood is there in the bar. However, Ronnie Wood did not play on that track, but it was Mick Taylor, the greatest Stones guitarist, and he hadn't played with the band. This was the first album that Mick showed up on since 1974's It's Only Rock and Roll. Rolling Stone considers this one of the 500 greatest albums of all times. I consider it probably the last great Stones album, and yes, you should have it. And the ballad side is great with Heaven. Slave is particularly good. I like that track. Great record. Last one Billy Preston played on, but also, sorry, I meant to tell you, on Waiting on a Friend, there is a sax solo. And this sax solo, hold on a second. I forgot to get the record that I wanted to talk to you about, so I have to step away just 1 second to get this record. I'm back. Sorry about that. Hey, whatever, a little action, huh? A little something to keep it interesting. But anyway, they had invited a all-time jazz great to play on that album. He actually plays on 2 or 3 songs. I don't recall exactly which but I do know, I think one is Slave or Heaven or whatever. I think one of the tracks is on the rock side and one is on the ballad side. But I'm talking of none other than Mr. Sonny Rollins. Mick was quite scared to ask Sonny to play, but Charlie, who's a big jazz aficionado, was really into it and keen to get Sonny to play, even though they were both nervous not knowing if he would. But guess what? He agreed. And that is him you hear on that great sax solo. Who's Sonny Rollins? Well, I'll tell you this much. He is a jazz giant. In fact, they gave him the nickname Saxophone Colossus, which he did have an album come out with that same name. But Sonny has written several songs that have become jazz standards. And in fact, more important, you could say, he invented strolling. What is strolling? It's a style of playing where Sonny had bass and drums to accompany him on his sax rather than a typical piano and what have you. So anyway, a certain style and a little trio that he invented is called strolling. So when you hear that with trios and whatnot, Sonny invented that whole style of playing. Real quick about Sonny's background. He grew up in New York, part of the time in Sugar Hill. Well, we all know that name because of the Sugar Hill Studios. Fantastic. In 1950, he was arrested for armed robbery. And again, a few years later, I think in 1952 or whatever, or maybe it was 1953. But within those 3 years, in his time away from being behind bars, he managed to record for other heavyweights or play with other heavyweights such as Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, and the Modern Jazz Quartet. Quite accomplished dude, if you ask me. One thing about Mr. Rollins, which I didn't recognize until later on when I got into him, which, by the way, my first introduction into Sonny Rollins was I bought a bootleg tape of I guess originally it was called Volume 1 on Blue Note, but I bought a bootleg cassette of it in Warsaw, Poland at a pirate tape vendor. But my first real introduction to Sonny, and some of you probably have been introduced and don't even know it, is he was the inspiration for Joe Jackson's Body and Soul album. And if you look at that album, you'll see he copied Sonny's album. Perfect. Anyway, let's get to this record that I happen to have in the shop. Sunny Days, Starry Nights. That was his 37th album. Oh my gosh. It was also considered his most commercial and accessible. Oh, I forgot to mention, everybody in the jazz world knows Sonny as, he's labeled as the world's greatest living improviser. So that should give you an idea about what Sonny likes to do. Also playing with Charlie Parker is another hint. And Thelonious Monk. But anyway, this album was a bit different for Sonny because it's considered to be his most commercial and accessible. But a lot of critics said it wasn't that good. However, famed New York music critic Robert Christgau did say, aside from it, this was being his most accessible and commercial. It is his best album in more than a decade, and it's soaked in the Pan-Caribbean style that this man, Sonny Rollins, really loved to play in. Sonny had also collected several awards, distinguished awards like, honorary doctorates from over 11 different universities, including Berkeley, Duke, and Juilliard. He also received international awards from like Sweden, Austria, and a Lifetime Grammy. That's it, guys. I'm stopping right there after Sonny, but let's review this real quick. Sonny, world's greatest improviser, played on this album, on Waiting on a Friend, which was the last great Stones album, the last Stones album to hit #1, and the last Stones album which featured this fella, Mr. Billy Preston, who started it all off. Thanks for spending time with me, guys. I'm always happy when you guys sit and watch and give me feedback. And please do, if there's something you want me to talk about or have a recommendation, you can get in touch here with a DM, if you will, or write me at noisyrecordsmx@hotmail.com. Thanks. You guys stay safe. Keep on rocking.